Afternoon, everyone, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you all on the occasion of the Gender and Equity Network South Asia, or GENSA's 1 year celebrations. It's been quite an incredible journey, and GENSA, as you know, is a special interest group of the community of evaluators South Asia, and it was launched last year on July 31st, 2020, with a vision to make significant contributions to the theory and the practice of the global evaluation agenda on gender and to enable conversations around integrating gender and equity issues into evaluation, and particularly unique to the South Asian context. And we're really happy to have completed the first year and proud to share that GENSA has grown into a network of 200 plus members. And we work collaboratively with several other networks and members from across South Asia. And you know, GENSA's backbone has been its core group of volunteers who, despite their very hectic work schedules, have owned this network and have made it their own. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their support and contribution. I think many of you who have attended GENSA's events would know them or recognize them. And before we move on, let me just share a small video that gives us a glimpse of a few of GENSA's achievements through this 1 year journey. Can we have the video, please?
Hello, everyone. And once again, welcome to GENSA's 1 year celebrations. We are all very, very excited to have you here. So thank you so much for joining us. It's truly wonderful and heartening to see all that GENSA has achieved in such a short span of time. But before requesting my friend Shweta to take over as moderator for the evening's events, I would like to thank some people who have been instrumental in helping us shape our dreams and have been our well-wishers and have extended their support in making GENSA what it is today. Some of our wonderful members have sent their heartfelt video and audio messages from across the globe in appreciation of the work done by us. And we would like to share some of them with you today. So another video. Can we have the video, please?
GENSA is transformative.
GENSA is a commitment towards gender equality.
GENSA is a collaborative space for me where we have all come together to learn and contribute towards a network of South Asian evaluators.
GENSA is, to me, my personal quote-unquote space for learning and reflective thinking. It has provided me the much needed opportunities to refine my skill set.
Hello, everyone. GENSA is a wonderful platform that connects people who are at different stages of their career. It helps newcomers meet experienced people in different fields. It helps to understand various roles. Uh, it helps understand research. It helps understand policy. It helps understand campaign, media, and a lot of other roles and responsibilities. Apart from that, it helps us share our work experiences. For me, my personal experience has been when my research paper got published, I shared it with GENSA and the members of GENSA. It was a wonderful experience. Uh, More than anything else, it's a great place to bond, discuss issues that affect us. GENSA is a family to me.
GENSA is the need of time.
GENSA means strengthening gendered evaluation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bijita Dev Sharma, and I'm one of the core group members of GENSA right since its inception last year. It gives me great pride to be a part of a network that is trying to bring about a lasting change in the evaluation ecosystem by integrating issues of gender and equity in the way evaluations are planned and designed in the South Asian region. We want GENSA to become that go-to platform for capacity building on gender-based evaluations in South Asia, and I think a beginning has already been made. GENSA has already made a headway in organizing regular webinars and skill-building sessions on gender and equity issues as it understands and recognizes the need for them. I feel lucky to be a part of this network and truly enjoy the interesting brainstorming and planning sessions that we hold internally. Let me take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sonal Zaveri, our coordinator, and all my other GENSA colleagues who have been a part of this journey with me. Thank you so much, and all the best, GENSA.
Well, on the occasion of our first year celebrations, we also wanted to do a stock taking and understand from our membership base how GENSA's membership benefited them and what are their future expectations from this network. Now, may I request my friend Neha to please share the results from our membership survey? Over to you, Neha.
Good evening. As GENSA completes 1 year, we wanted to understand from our members their experiences of engagement with GENSA over the last 1 year. What are their expectations from the network and how they would want to contribute in the coming year? We received about 26 responses, and here are a few highlights. Motivation for members to join GENSA was primarily to learn about gender transformative evaluations and learn and collaborate with evaluation experts. What members seek in the coming year are more skill building sessions and opportunities for young evaluators to collaborate with senior evaluators, and also more representation from across South Asia. We are also delighted to know that many of you have expressed interest in volunteering with us. We look forward to collaborating with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Neha, for those insightful updates on what our members feel and have to say. This will really help us plan ahead. Now it's time to dive right into the wonderful session that we have lined up with none other than Katherine Hay, who has been kind enough to agree to give her time despite the fact that she is currently on a family vacation. So without wasting any more time, let me request Mr. Ram Khanal from Nepal to introduce Katherine. Mr. Ram Chandra Khanal is from Nepal and is a founding member of COA South Asia. He has served as chair of the Community of Evaluators in Nepal. His academic background is in agricultural economics, and his expertise is evaluating green sector projects and programs, including inclusive development and climate resilience. Over to you, Ram.
Ram, you need to unmute. Sorry.
Let me take the privilege of introducing our guest of honors, Katherine Hay, today. Katherine is currently the Deputy Director of Gender Equality at the Gates Foundation, where she leads several initiatives for women's economic empowerment. She has brought critical gender issues into mainstream funding, government research and evaluation programs, including those on closing gaps in women's employment and scaling successful platforms for women's empowerment collectives. She has spent 2 decades in South Asia, working on large-scale women's empowerment, livelihoods, health programs, bringing an intersectional gender lens to that work, asking who is being left behind. Katherine coined evaluation field building, positioning evaluation as transformative, and has been named to Apolitical's 100 most influential people in gender policy list in 2021. A warm welcome to Katherine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, and congratulations to GENSA for completing your first year. I want to thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back with many of you who I've worked with for a number of years. I've been working on using evaluation and research for social change for about 2 decades, and much of that time doing so from South Asia. So it's really great to see this new network taking shape and to see so many people getting active in it. Because one of my interests has always been attracting new talent to the evaluation space and getting emerging, activist, thoughtful young leaders really to come into this space. So hearing some of those voices and how they've been engaging through GENSA is just fantastic. So thank you very much, and it's great to be with all of you. The GENSA team asked me to speak on surfacing inequity and being the change. So just pulling up, I have a few slides that I'm going to just really largely speak around. But just starting first with the title slide, I wanted to say a few words about that. I'm going to share some opening remarks really, and then we're going to have time for questions and I think some discussion, because of course evaluation is such a practice area, it's such an applied area of work. And so I think it's often really in talking about the work we've done or getting into questions around our practice that we can really learn the most from each other. But just taking the title of my talk, Surfacing Inequity and Being the Change, you know, the first piece really is around that surfacing inequity. And I'm going to talk about the systems we live in, those larger systems, and how inequities are perpetuated within those systems, and talk a little bit about how practices and professions, including evaluation and research, can perpetuate inequities and reinforce inequities, and that if one doesn't take a stance, then that really is going to be sort of where one finds oneself in terms of the work that we're all doing. Evaluation can also surface inequities and be part of that change. So I want to talk a little bit about that at the beginning. And then I also want to talk about some more practical ideas. So if you're convinced and if you do believe that evaluation can be a space for change and can be a disruptor, as I call it, then I thought we could talk a little bit about, well, how and what does that look like, and what might that mean for me. And some of you may have experiences as well that I think could be shared in the chat. But let me just start then with that that first idea of the system we live in. So if you could advance to the next slide. So I think that there's a lot of different countries represented in the group, and I would maybe just ask for those of you thinking about your own country, the country that you reside in, or the country that you're from, to ask whether inequity has increased over time, including as you've had economic growth in your country. Most countries have had economic growth over the last 2 decades. Has there been growing inequity or growing equity? So as people have accumulated wealth, has that, has there been a growing divide between the sort of richer or poorer, the haves, the have-nots, or sort of a closing divide? And I would ask you to maybe just think about your own country and whether that's the case. mean, certainly most of the countries of the world have actually been characterized by increasing inequity. And so even though on average you've had sort of growth and you've had sort of standards increasing, you've had a growing inequity and a larger, a widening of the gap between those who have and those who have not. And so I think we can, say fairly safely that equity is not the primary driving goal that underpins the key policies, programs of most of the countries that we find ourselves in. In fact, equity is often knowingly and readily sacrificed for other types of economic or other goals. And so if one starts with the premise of increasing equity, and that's what one of your professional goals is, or your work or life goals, I mean, fundamentally, we exist in systems, economic systems, social systems that are not aligned or oriented, or where the North Star of those systems is not around increasing equity. And so that to me becomes where one thinks about one's practice. And so if evaluation is part of those systems, how does evaluation then do the job of surfacing or illustrating or addressing inequities if evaluation itself is part of a larger system that fundamentally kind of reinforces, perpetuates, or expands inequities over time? And I think particularly where that takes us is that if the pathway is not towards growing equity, that assuming that evaluation can be part of a solution that takes you towards equity in that larger context is naive. And so essentially my challenge would be that if you're not actively using evaluation and actively bringing in a lens to use it to bring in equity or to address inequities, then you're very likely perpetuating or reinforcing existing inequities, because those are the systems that we are based in. So I just want to talk a little bit about an example. So in case, there are some on the call who would disagree, who would say, no, that's not really correct. The dominant pathway is really one of greater equity, and that is where our policies and our systems are moving on their own. And again, I think there are some cases where we certainly had a lot of progress. And so again, which is fantastic. But I think that, in many of our societies, we do exist within models of development that, perpetuate and reinforce inequities, or really, frankly, that are fairly comfortable with inequities. So I just have a few bullet points there, just taking one example, and I'm sure from the areas you work, you could take many other examples. I've chosen to just take an example of the economic impacts of women during the pandemic over the last sort of year and a half would have been the economic impacts. And I've taken a bit of a global remit, but I think you could look at, a range of communities, marginalized groups that make sense in the context of your own work, and think about what of those change processes looked over time. But just to illustrate the point, if we look pre-pandemic, I'm just going to show out a few sort of statistics or a few data points just to sort of make the point. But just starting with one statistic, pre-pandemic, globally, women's poverty levels were expected to decrease by 2.7% between 2019 and 2021. And now women's poverty levels are predicted to increase by 9.1%. We're seeing the economic impacts of the pandemic, and this is across multiple countries, push many women out of the labor force completely. And there's a risk that many will never return. We see, again, across multiple countries, women are overrepresented in the lowest paying sectors. And there's a range of reasons for this. There's gender norms, but there's also laws. 88 economies have laws that restrict the jobs and hours that women can work, affecting 1.6 billion women. So that leads women to be overrepresented in sectors more affected by COVID-19, such as education, retail, tourism, hospitality, and home-based enterprises. Access to capital, huge barrier. Women have less access to capital and markets. Women business leaders more affected than male counterparts. They have had such huge increases in domestic responsibilities, such as homeschooling, caring for dependent, unpaid care, things that women were already doing, much more so than their male counterparts. So even though men's unpaid care at home also increased, their childcare work also increased, the demand for women's unpaid care work has surged. And in many countries, most countries, women are spending about 30 hours, upwards of 30 hours a week on sort of home-based and childcare. That's essentially a full-time job. So what I'm saying here is this inequity didn't just happen. There's nothing biological about the pandemic that would put these kinds of economic impacts more squarely on the shoulders of women. It's a result of social and economic policies and institutions. And it's come out in country after country, month after month, we have new data. And as these stories come out, and as this burden comes out, showing sort of how precarious women's economic livelihoods are, it's almost hardly sort of warrants a blip. There's sort of people read the stories and, oh yeah, that's difficult, that's a problem. But there's not sort of a shock or well, we really fundamentally have to change our policies and programs. We have to change our systems. And that's what I mean about, there's a recognition, there's a comfort with our systems that they do produce and that they recreate and they reinforce inequities. And there's a fundamental comfort with that in most of our societies. We're not sort of shocked and appalled and immediately spring to action when we see those inequities. And so what I'm trying to use with this example is just to say that, well, there's obviously a lot of positive changes in the world. There's a lot of positive policies and developments. Development is not an inevitable march towards equity. That's what I'm trying to say. Development pathways shape and determine the nature of programs. So whether you're evaluating at the level of sort of policies or whether you're evaluating the level of sort of like large scale national programs or small, NGO run, programs at a community level. But what I'm trying to say is that all of those levels, the development pathways that we sort of live within, the systems we live within, shape and determine the nature of those programs and the extent to which equity is prioritized or not prioritized. So just moving on to slide 3. So if you see evaluation as the arm of a system that's meant to reinforce, create, perpetuate, or ignore inequities, there's really not much scope for having evaluation be the change. However, if you see evaluation as a disruptor, a potential disruptor in those systems, as a way of broadening the value conversation, as a way of creating questions around, well, why is this? And are we comfortable with sort of year after year of continued and growing inequity? So if you see evaluation as a being potentially disruptive, it becomes a different story where evaluation is not simply part of a larger machinery that's fairly comfortable with inequity, but really where evaluation can play a role in being sort of a disruptor, can be a way of sort of broadening out the conversation and asking different questions around, well, who's deciding what's valued? Who's deciding what data is looked at around value? And that's, I think, where there's openings for evaluation to have this disruptive potential. Rather than sort of evaluation on the other, sort of to create a parallel, evaluation can also be sort of a technocratic exercise of propping up the status quo, where you're kind of rubber stamping or only looking at the questions that are being asked through the sort of dominant system, and essentially in doing so kind of propping up the current or the dominant system. And sometimes this tension that I'm speaking to, or this choice of being a disruptor, gets kind of cloaked under the veil of science and rigor. And so the idea of kind of being a disruptor can sometimes be critiqued because, well, isn't evaluation meant to be scientific and rigorous? And isn't it biased to try and be biased towards equity? And aren't you then moving into an activist space as opposed to a scientific or a rigorous space? And I think that those are really kind of ways of throwing evaluators off track. And really, I would say just a couple of points about sort of the role of the evaluator as a value, as ascribing value, and also the role of bias. And so historically, evaluation has drawn heavily, or some branches of evaluation have drawn heavily from sort of more technocratic traditions, and sort of the desire for distance or the moorings of detachment kind of are often used to claim sort of greater rigor, etc. But really that idea of detached evaluation is an illusion, because systems evaluation doesn't operate outside of systems, and values shape what gets evaluated, which questions get asked and which do not, who gets asked. So confusing rigor with detachment, it really just means you're propping up the status quo. So I think I have a quote there from Davidson, who elegantly argues that evaluative reasoning is inherently about infusing value, and getting the values right is the core part of evaluation's validity. Like, even just take the word evaluation. Essentially, evaluation, the part of research that evaluation is fundamentally about ascribing value. So if you're looking at a policy or a program, you're fundamentally making a judgment. It's not sort of descriptive research. You're trying to assess, is this value of this program worth the investment that society, through taxes, that government, etc., that this NGO is making in it. So fundamentally, evaluation is about ascribing value. And so when I talk about infusing sort of equity into that, what you're doing is bringing in a perspective that is really trying to bring equity into to the surface. So asking, well, whose values matter? What outcomes matter? What's being valued, and also what is not? And really transparently to try to bring in more inclusive values, including equity, into those discussions. And how do you do this? Well, using whatever tools and openings are appropriate. And again, these are not new arguments that I'm making here. So for those of you who studied different branches of evaluation, certainly those branches of evaluation rooted in epistemologies of participation definitely provide alternate understandings of rigor that come from that engagement, where really your rigor, or the rigor of the evaluation, really comes from engaging with those who are most affected by these systems, who are most marginalized, and that's where your rigor comes from, by working to increase social justice for disenfranchised groups. So I had just wanted to say a few words around kind of rigor, bias, but really also to fundamentally start with the position that if you're not looking at trying to disrupt, if you're working within a larger system that evaluation has become a core part of, and assuming that others in that system, so whether you're the evaluator and you're looking to the evaluation commissioner to bring in equity, or you're the evaluator and you're hoping the communities will be the ones who say, well, we're not going to participate unless this is more participatory, or unless you start to look at values that matter to us. If you're looking for everyone else in the system to bring in equity, or alternatively, if you're the commissioner, if you're hoping others will bring in equity, we can't sort of keep looking to others. I think the question becomes, how do I, in the role I play in the system, bring in equity, rather than waiting for others to identify it and to play that role, but really thinking about, in the role I'm playing, where can I bring that in? Next slide. So I don't have a lot of time to go into specific concrete examples, but I would just like to say that I've done this, and I'm sure many of you have done this, really across at different points in the evaluation process. And so what I've just said here is, essentially, if the exercise is trying to recognize inequities as structural, trying to recognize evaluation as value laden and as an opportunity to sort of challenge some of those larger inequities, and to raise and to bring in different values, and essentially a choice to value equity. There's different places that one can bring that into the evaluation process. Certainly in the questions being asked, in the framing of what matters, what outcomes matter, what's being valued. In the design of the evaluation, there's different designs that can surface inequities, that can be designed around addressing equity or bringing in an equity. Certainly in the conduct and how the evaluation happens, so how different stakeholders are engaged throughout the process, and how the evaluation is done. I mean, the analysis is a key stage, even where you may not even need to add additional questions, but just choosing what to analyze or not, to do a disaggregated analysis, to look at sort of who are getting the gains, who's being left out. So there's choices that are made at the analysis stage that can sort of bring a lens to equity or not. And then certainly in terms of use, because fundamentally, if the evaluations are not used, if the implementation research isn't used, then it's not going to be driving or changing or addressing equity. So really here, I think, again, depending on the role that you're playing, you know, are you a commissioner, are you an evaluator, are you part of a team, et cetera? Are you someone whose intervention or program is being evaluated? I mean, I think there's different places that you can try to bring in this idea of equity into your process. And again, I think there's challenges to doing so. You know, adding in a whole different questionnaire can add costs to surveys, et cetera. So there's different trade-offs. There's often real power hierarchies. There's often many times evaluation is a field that has a lot of consultant-driven or consultant supported work, and so there's obviously a power differential between, you know, consultants, say, and funders, and consultants trying to convince funders to add things in. So I'm not saying it's sort of, you know, easy and that one can just design all evaluations in this way and roll them out this way. Engaging with communities, trying to value their knowledge, trying to make sure that results go back to communities, are used by them. You know, there's time costs here, and these are things that have to be negotiated. There can also be political barriers to including a focus on equity, especially when there's a fear of negative findings. So again, I'm not trying to say that it's simple or it's easy. In fact, it's complex, it's challenging. Like most things that are worth doing, it's difficult to do. But really, I think what I wanted to say, just to sort of spark off this conversation and to, again, sort of celebrate this year of GENSA, is to say that, you know, change happens all the time, and opportunities and windows will open all the time. And with evaluation, I think if you're thinking ahead, if you're really trying to find space to address inequities, sometimes you can insert questions into surveys, you can raise issues. When you then have the data, the analysis, windows may be opening, people may be asking those questions. The fact that you were early out of the gates and trying to bring these issues in can mean that then the analysis is there, the data is there when others are sort of more ready to hear it. And I think rather than sort of, again, waiting for others to take this on, it's really about thinking about how can I take this on, and where do I, you know, bring these pieces in. And just as policymakers and leaders have to be accountable for their intentionality around closing equity gaps, I think so do we as evaluators also have that responsibility. So working to bring equity and equity lens into our evaluation practice doesn't weaken the rigor of evaluation. Really, it just makes explicit whether you value equity or not. And in raising these questions, we make our own values transparent. And in the field of evaluation, we're not simply observers of society or development, we're participants in the way that it unfolds. And so what I would argue is that we, as participants, we need to take a position on equity, be transparent on the values we place on it, and be active in measuring it with the tools and techniques at our disposals. And if we don't, we're just reinforcing existing biases within development pathways by not making explicit and transparent the values that are being ignored. So with that, I'll stop, and I think we've got some time for questions and sharing. But again, thank you for letting me share my thoughts, and again, thank you for creating this network so that evaluators can come together, and others and researchers, and talk about how to bring gender and equity into your practice and research and work.
Well, thank you so much, Katherine, for that truly insightful and interesting session. I'm sure all present here must have immensely benefited from this. This bill also ties really well with GENSA's vision to highlight equity and integrate gender into the evaluation practice in the South Asian region. Now it's time to take up some of the questions and comments. Can I request my colleague Amrita?
Thanks, Shweta. As of right now, there aren't any in the chat box, so I would request people to, if they have any questions, any comments, to put it in the chat box, so you can unmute yourself and ask the question as well.
I think there is one comment that is there, which is saying that love the phrase evaluator as a disruptor, and one of the best examples of Sandra Harding's standpoint methodology. Anything that you would like to speak to that, Katherine?
No, I think it just gets again to that point that I was making on sort of bias. And I mean, I would argue, and I think as Sandra Harding and others have done, really, that we all carry a lot of biases, and some of those may be obvious to us, but others may not be. And they may just simply come from sort of our lived experience and sort of our own experience and how we sort of have lived in the world. And in fact, it's not by sort of pretending that we can live in a detached way without any bias that you get to rigor, but rather it's by sharing, like, here are my biases. I am a white Canadian woman who has grown up in a particular context, who sees the world in ways that are shaped by that experience that may not be obvious to me, but which may be obvious to others who've had a different experience. And so I think I have a bias for equity. I want to look at those patterns. I think the idea is really that it's by sharing your lenses, it's by sharing your values, it's by sharing and being open and transparent about your own experience, that where you can really get to rigor, rather than by pretending that I am sort of a detached observer who is not sort of a participant or engaged in any way or part of society, but somehow I'm detached from it. And therefore my values are not shaped or influenced by my experiences, my positioning, my standpoint, really, but rather I would believe the opposite, that you get to a stronger rigor and more less bias by sort of sharing your own standpoint and where you're situated and how that may be shaping your lens. And so it's more you get to more rigor through more transparency.
There is one question that says, that asks, how does one deal with evaluators, organizations which are hierarchical and unwilling to share tools with organizations being evaluated? How can evaluation contribute towards equity if in principle there is hierarchy? So
let me see. So I think I take that as a question around sort of if one is working in, again, it's the systems questions, right? We live in these larger systems, economic systems, other systems, community, household systems that are inequitable. And so too, do we work in organizations that also mirror patriarchal, casteist, other types of inequities within our organizations? And so I'm taking the question as, when your own organization also mirrors those hierarchies and inequities, how do we operate? And again, I would say, I guess I come back to the point on disruptor. And so I think it's thinking about, well, first of all, within that organization, can you be that voice of change? Can you be an intentional disruptor? Certainly, I've worked in organizations that have not asked me to bring an equity lens or a gender lens into evaluations of, say, more standard health evaluations. But where I chose to do that, and I did take that in and integrated that, and then there was traction. And when I think people saw those results, there was some support for those results. And the fact that the support came from people fairly high up in the organization brought some of the other sort of more mid-level managers along, who were not necessarily that excited about gender or equity being integrated or being a lens of the organization. So I would say, if you are in an organization that doesn't sort of share some of those values, look around you. Are there allies who do? Are there champions or leaders who could advocate with you? Are there things that you can do to integrate and bring in an equity lens almost by stealth? I mean, some of the things don't necessarily cost a lot of money. I talked about analysis. We have so much gender disaggregated data that's just never analyzed. And so it doesn't necessarily even mean doing like adding modules or adding questions or adding things that will add costs, but it's just a different analysis that can show some of those differences. So I would say looking at some of those opportunities. And if you're in a context that's really not only, say, not necessarily open to or exploring or progressive, but is actively thwarting you, then it's maybe time to join a more progressive group where you can take forward some of these approaches. In terms of capacities, on the question on capacities, I would say that bringing a gender and an equity lens into your evaluation practice, let me answer that question two ways. I think that there's a set of competencies and capacities to do good implementation, policy research, evaluation generally. And so there's a set of competencies there that are both sort of more technical competencies around sort of instrument design, community engagement, et cetera. I mean, there's a whole set of competencies there around sort of designing, building out, conducting, leading an evaluation. And certainly that's an area where there's been a lot of growth in South Asia on building those competencies. But, again, there's still a lot of limitations. There's not very many university level programs. This is still a fairly young field globally. And certainly we don't have a lot of as much programs and opportunities as one needs. But I think that's definitely an advancing space. I think then overlaying, well, what about the gender and the equity dimensions of that, and what does that look like for trained evaluators, and how do you bring that in? I think there's different ways that you can do that. Certainly, again, I would say that the sort of feminist research space is also very, very rich in South Asia. And I think one of the ways that one can leapfrog is actually by bringing together these communities. So bringing together feminist researchers with strong evaluation practitioners, sharing tools and approaches and lenses. Often it is, social science research methods and tools that you're using, but it's applying that gender lens to those tools. So it's the questions that are being asked, it's the approaches being used, and that's overlain on sort of existing social science methods, such as sort of participatory research techniques, but also more quantitative techniques, for example, such as the types of quantitative analysis you may want to do to sort of uncover pathways or particular pathways or opportunities around addressing, say, marginalizations.
Catherine, there's a question that by Mridu. She's asking, as you rightly pointed out, that addressing inequities could be difficult, but it is worth it. I feel it is even more challenging during online or virtual evaluation. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think I'd love to hear from the group actually in the chat if people have experiences, certainly in terms of engaging directly with those who've been impacted by policies and programs. There's a lot of challenges of reach in terms of safety, in terms of making sure that people can safely share information privately. So ensuring ensuring that you're actually able to get, sometimes we're looking at quite sensitive information. And so women, victims of violence, etc., I mean, are often in contexts where it's just not safe for the evaluator to assume that they can speak privately. There's access issues just in terms of who has access to phones, etc., to be able to get the data. So there's definitely a lot of challenges in the collection and engagement. In terms of the use, I would imagine that there may be some opportunities, because one of the things I think we're seeing, and again, this would depend on your context, is that there is a little bit more access in terms of Zoom meetings, access to policymakers, being able to get meetings in place. Like in some contexts, like the ability to do Zoom calls has actually created some opportunities there. But overall, I would agree that I think the types of use cases for equity often involve organizing, They often involve, engaging also with kind of more activist community advocates, with media. So it's often not a straightforward path where you simply generate the results and then everyone takes it forward, but it's often a path over time of getting results out. Advocates may be picking up some of the findings. So there's often a sort of more time-bound process that requires coordination, collaboration, collectivization, and that is definitely very challenging to do in a virtual space. And especially, we talked about earlier just how the increased work burden at home on women in particular, but on certainly on everyone. But if those same people are also having an increased burden in terms of childcare, in terms of educating their kids at home, etc., then trying to find that time to engage in making sure that those findings are used in getting their results out there to different stakeholders and users definitely becomes challenging. So I would agree that the challenge is there. And then the other, I think, issue is that often equity is something that's posited as like an icing, right? Well, if we get other things addressed, then that's when we'll look to equity. And in the context of a pandemic that has been so devastating economically in terms of countries' health systems, it can also be easy to, communicate a message that, well, the equity pieces, it's not that it's unimportant, but we have these bigger issues that we have to first address. And so it can be hard to get attention for ensuring that equity is part of those solutions, even though it's fundamental to be part of those solutions. But it can almost be sometimes, it can be difficult. And when there's limited resources, it can also be a way for those who actually don't believe in equity and that's not their driving priority, as we talked about at the beginning, to simply say, well, it's not the time. We've got bigger issues and we have to focus on X and Y, and we'll come back to your issue later. And so I would agree that it is a challenging time, and despite a lot of the attention to the inequities that have been created and reinforced around COVID, I think that we're not going to necessarily see the commitments that we've been hearing actually realized on the ground without, as has always been the case, without a lot of work of activists and people just holding their governments and others accountable for delivering on those commitments.
Thank you. There are two more questions. One is asking, are there any tools in gender evaluation where we can also check whether the values of evaluators are not influencing the outcomes? That is one, by Kasturi. The other is asking, in most cases, equity is not part of the project, but as an afterthought, in a measurement approach, how can we take affirmative action to reduce inequity? So there is somewhat similarity between the two to a certain extent, because both are asking for tools.
So on tools, there's a lot of tools out there, and I would encourage you to have a look at Gender Eval website. There's MyM&E, there's UNICEF. I've helped build out different toolkits. So there's a lot of tools and guides and training materials out there on how to do gender evaluation. So definitely have a look, and there are a lot of resources from kind of very applied tools and frameworks and guides, and again, in different disciplines, there's some interesting work. I just reviewed a really interesting paper that's coming out on integrating an equity and gender lens into health evaluation. So again, yes, there are tools out there. In terms of how to ensure your values aren't biasing, again, I think you heard me earlier on. I would say I'm okay with my values showing up in my evaluations. And I think what's important is to say, here's what I value. So I value equity. And so I'm ensuring that we're looking at disaggregated analysis and not looking just at the average effect sizes, but really looking at who's benefiting and who's not. And so, obviously you want to make sure your calculations are accurate, but yes, that's like skewing the evaluation to look at questions around equity as opposed to not looking at questions on equity. So definitely a lot of tools out there. In terms of the question on, well, what if the intervention didn't intentionally mean to look at equity? And this to me is like most of the time that's the case. But I think that there's a really huge space where you can still integrate equity in evaluations, and that is often at the question space, at the analysis stage, at the use stage, and often interventions have additional phases of work, or they have other steps coming. And so if you, for example, are looking at a health evaluation, and you do look at, and nobody's necessarily designed that intervention to particularly address, say, very young married women or a particular community. It was just an intervention around, say, breastfeeding. And you evaluated and you also asked, well, were there groups that were particularly excluded from this, or were included, or were the gains only for particular groups? Were poorer women more impacted or less impacted? So in doing that evaluation, you can surface some of those patterns, which then can ideally get traction with the program implementers, the funders, who, if you show them, you're having a big impact on this group, but these women who are, say, more distant from the center, or who are poorer, or who are younger, they're not being as they're not being as impacted. And yet we have these outliers. So we found these outliers who were having high impacts, and we did qualitative interviews, and here's why we found that these women who were distant, or from these groups who on average didn't have very good effects, had high impacts. And here's what we learned from them. And you could bring this into the program if you wanted to have a bigger impact, right? So that's an example of how a program that had no necessarily design around having on sort of particularly targeting marginalized groups, where you can bring that into an evaluation in a way that can surface some of those inequities, and also hopefully create pathways for use that can drive greater equity, either in a next phase of that program, or in programs of that nature, for things that other program designers should consider.
A last one, I think, from Jamie. He's asking, I would like to ask for Katherine's opinion about how to be a disruptor evaluator without compromising with politicians involved in the results of evaluation.
Without compromising the politicians?
Politicians involved in the results of evaluation.
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about South Asia, I mean, but really in any context, in my experience, most program leads, whether they're, government programs or whether they're NGOs, like, nobody likes to find out that their program wasn't a success. And when you talk about government, those are powerful people, and they particularly don't like to find out that their programs were not a success, or that their programs didn't work for particular groups. And I think trying to understand how can you get to the use that you want to have? And so I think it's a process. So figuring out, am I going to be working really closely with government? Do I have stakeholders here that are really open, who want me to be discreet about findings, but they genuinely are going to act on them and try to bring change, but they don't necessarily want a whole lot of media scrutiny? So am I going to be a disruptor from the inside, where I can hold a mirror to these programs and work with my government stakeholders, maybe bureaucrats more so than politicians, but got players within the system who want to bring change, but who want to have the space to bring that change without necessarily having it become kind of a witch hunt. And so you can work as a sort of critical friend, as I call it, working with kind of aligned government programs and stakeholders. You can also play a role where you agree that the data will be shared and made available. So in some contexts that can be possible, and where you may you may share that your findings with government, but make the data publicly available so that others, activists, advocates who take a more challenging stance, journalists, have access to your data, your findings, and they can use that in ways that are sort of more actively or more activist per se, and where they can be engaging in a democratic process as civil society, demanding change of their political representatives. So I think I've given you two pieces of that story, but I think that fundamentally we live in very inequitable systems, and if nobody's accountable and held accountable or takes accountability, like, they're not going to change. So if everybody was doing everything great, if all our programs were working, we wouldn't have the kind of inequities we have. And so there does have to be a holding people accountable. But I do think that I've also had success in some cases where you do have alignment and intersecting values or intersecting alignment with some governments, programs, officials, where you have enough shared values that there is a space there that you can work together and find the ways to work together where your data, your approach to the evaluation hits their shared goals, and where they want to bring that change, and where you can position that evaluation, even when it is surfacing gaps, as a positive, where they're working to identify those gaps and address those gaps. And so I think that's also possible too. Again, it depends on your context, but I agree sometimes it's very difficult, and we're certainly working in a time when a lot of governments are not letting people share data, are very close to negative findings, and where even sharing negative findings can be seen as being sort of anti-national. So I don't want to understate your question.
Thank you. And I would hand it over to Shweta.
Yeah, thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Katherine. So now, as we move towards the end of today's event, we want to thank each one of you present here. May I now invite Rajiv Nandi, Associate Director, Institute of Social Studies Trust, New Delhi, who is also a member of Governing Board, COE South Asia, and a well-wisher and huge supporter of GENSA since its inception days, to extend a vote of thanks to Katherine Hay.
Thank you, Amrita, for requesting me to propose a vote of thanks today. Yeah, dear friends and colleagues, it's really wonderful to see that GENSA is now 1 year old. But within such a short span of time, GENSA achieved visibility and global recognition for the initiatives it has taken. I'd like to congratulate GENSA on this occasion. At the same time, it's amazing to see that the person who co-leaded the evaluation movement in India from the front row in the initial years, some 14, 15 years back, is present here today and still motivating us with knowledge and expertise in the arena of gender and equity. Yes, I'm speaking about Katherine Hay. GENSA family is thankful to Katherine for gracing this event with her presence and valuable inputs and comments today. But perhaps this is also a time to acknowledge that that GENSA is built on that base that she co-created with other co-leaders from South Asia. And personally, I must mention my deep sense of appreciation for Katherine for continuing her support for the next generation leaders and champions. Let me also put on record my hearty thanks to all GENSA members for attending and engaging and contribute today. Today's dialogue will help us to build our next steps of action. Finally, would propose a round of applause for the GENSA coordinator, Sonal Zaveri, for her excellent leadership, and a brilliant, enthusiastic, and committed team of volunteers at GENSA for their tireless efforts behind all events and campaigns in last 1 year, and definitely this event in particular. It is just the beginning of our journey, but surely we'll take this network forward to bring the gender and equity issues in the forefront of the development discourse in South Asia and beyond. Thank you.